The crow took 2 lives from John Johnson, his wife and his unborn child. So he decided to collect the debt. By the time he was done, his ledger showed a balance of several hundred crow warriors. His vengeance wasn't just bloody, it was meticulously accounted for. This isn't a story of a man descending into madness. It's a story of brutal, horrifying arithmetic, where the only currency was human life, and Johnson was determined to come out ahead. Before he was an oath, he was just a man. In 1843, John Johnston arrived in St. Joseph, Missouri, looking like he'd been carved out of the very mountains he was heading toward. He was young but carried the physical weight of a veteran, a 6-foot, 190-pound frame of dense muscle with unnervingly long arms. His cold, gray-blue eyes sat in a face framed by a thick red beard, giving him the air of a man who was already tired of a world he had barely entered. He didn't wait long to make an impression. When a dockside thief tried to snatch his bag, Johnston didn't shout or grapple. He simply laid the man out with a single, devastating punch, a move of such brutal efficiency it served as his unofficial introduction to the frontier. There was no argument, only a result. His first formal business dealing was a lesson in the West's more subtle forms of violence. He walked into the trading post of the famously slick Joe Robidoux, who saw the big, quiet kid as an easy mark. Robidoux sold him beaver traps at a wildly inflated price, smiling to himself. But Johnston walked out with more than overpriced steel. He also had a brand new Hawken rifle and a superb Comanche horse, the 19th century equivalent of a high-performance vehicle. Robidoux won the battle of wits, but he'd unwittingly armed a future legend. It was the last time Johnston would be on the losing end of a transaction. His education was just beginning, and the curriculum was about to get much more severe. In the wilderness, Johnston found his mentor in John Hatcher, a veteran trapper whose personality was equal parts wisdom and cynical bluster. Hatcher took the greenhorn under his wing and provided him with a postgraduate course in staying alive. The lessons were not inspiring tales of courage. They were brutal, pragmatic maxims delivered without sentiment. Never give a red coon a chance, Hatcher advised, a piece of frontier philosophy that prioritized breathing over morality. Johnston, a man who preferred action to conversation, absorbed these cold equations without comment. He was the perfect student for a curriculum written in blood. His first exam came in a flurry of motion. A dozen Arapaho warriors descended on their camp, and Johnston reacted with the unthinking instinct of a predator. An arrow bit deep into his right shoulder, a wound that should have ended his fight. Instead, he simply turned and brought his Hawken down on the attacker's head, killing him instantly. As Hatcher professionally dispatched 2 more, the remaining Arapaho seemed to collectively decide that this was a bad investment of their time and vanished. The violence was as sudden as a lightning strike, and just as final. Afterwards, Hatcher provided the next lesson. He yanked the arrow from Johnston's shoulder and then, with the detached air of a butcher, gave a calm demonstration on how to scalp the dead. Johnston followed the instructions perfectly. His work described as clean and sure as his teacher's. He wasn't haunted, he was certified. His only comment on the matter was a chillingly simple declaration: "Slicin' a man don't bother me none." His capacity for violence was not just learned, it was innate. When Hatcher was cornered by a grizzly bear, Johnston didn't hesitate. He closed the distance and plunged his knife into the beast's heart, cleverly leaving the blade inside to cause internal bleeding while he avoided the thrashing claws. He never took credit for the tactic. To him, it was just the logical solution to a lethal problem. He was also honing his own unique combat style, developing a set of powerful kicks that could end a fight before it began. In a trade dispute, he slammed a Sioux warrior to the ground with such force that it killed him on impact. He then, according to the legend, proceeded to kill 5 of the man's companions with nothing but his fists. He was becoming less a man and more a force of nature, a walking, breathing deterrent to anyone foolish enough to challenge him. For all his brutality, John Johnston was not immune to the quieter parts of life. In early 1847, he found something other than pelts and danger in the mountains. He arrived at a Flathead tribe encampment and married a woman named the Swan. He treated her not as property, which was the unfortunate standard for many trappers' wives, but as a partner. He gave her a Tennessee rifle, taught her how to shoot it, and took the time to learn her language. He built a cabin on the Little Snake River, a small piece of stability in a life defined by motion. For a brief moment, the predator had a home. He had a future, and that made him vulnerable. In May, while Johnston was away trapping, a party of about 20 young Crow warriors found the cabin. They were inexperienced, full of the reckless confidence of youth, looking to make a name for themselves. They crept up to the clearing, applied their war paint, and waited. The swan, pregnant with their child, stepped out of the cabin. It was a simple, domestic moment that was met with an act of unspeakable violence. A warrior struck her from behind with an axe, and she fell without a sound. They scalped her and looted the cabin, taking everything of value. In their haste, they overlooked one item: a large brass kettle sitting by a stool. They had no idea that the pot they left behind would become the vessel for a promise. When Johnston returned, the first thing he felt was the silence. It was a dead, empty quiet where life should have been. He found his wife's skull, picked clean by scavengers. Nearby, he saw another, smaller object, and the horrifying truth settled in his mind. "Two was killed here," he reportedly stated. His voice devoid of emotion, a simple, factual observation of an unbearable reality. Then he found the single eagle feather that served as a signature. "Crow," he whispered. It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. He knew who was responsible for the void that had once been his life. There was no screaming, there was no breakdown, there was only a cold, methodical purpose. Johnston gathered the bones of his wife and his unborn child and placed them reverently into the brass pot the crow had left behind. He added the eagle feather to the collection, a symbol of the debt that was now owed. He carried the pot to a deep, rocky crevice, hiding it away to protect it from the wilderness that had already taken everything else. That night, Johnston climbed to the summit of Battle Mountain. Standing alone under the moon, he did not weep. He made a vow. It was a promise of a private and unending war, a declaration of merciless revenge he would wage upon the entire Crow Nation. The man who had been a predator in service of his own survival was now a predator in service of the dead. The accounting had begun. The vow John Johnston made on Battle Mountain was not a promise spoken to the sky. It was a directive he would follow for the next 2 decades. Starting in 1848, a new kind of story began to haunt the high country. It was a story told in whispers of Crow warriors found dead with a chillingly consistent signature. They were not just scalped, each was found with a deep cut beneath the ribs, a wound from which the liver had been cleanly excised. This grimly repeated mutilation was the work of one man with a singular, terrifying purpose. His friends, seasoned trappers like Delguay, were the first to confirm the unbelievable. Johnston was eating the livers. He wasn't doing it for sustenance, but as they put it, upon principle. It was a profound spiritual insult, a calculated desecration intended to haunt his victims into the afterlife. The name John Johnston was buried with his family. From the ashes rose the liver eater. His campaign was not a war of grand battles. It was a slow, stalking vengeance, a deeply personal string of assassinations. For years he became a ghost in the mountains, an invisible force that brought death to any Crow warrior who crossed his path. He would strike a hunting party, ambush a lone rider, or slip into a camp in the dead of night, leaving behind only his ghastly handiwork before vanishing again into the wilderness. The Crow, a people who built their own legends on warfare, gave him a name of his own, Dopiak Absaroka, the Crow Killer. His reputation became its own weapon, a tool of psychological warfare that did half the work for him. In one famous encounter, a Crow war party had him perfectly cornered with every advantage. Johnston simply killed the first warrior to show himself. The others, faced with the living monster from their nightmares, broke and fled. He was no longer a man with a rifle, he was an unstoppable idea. The proof of his bloody ledger was not left in the wilderness. He would ride into forts like Laramie with mules carrying prime beaver pelts, the quality of which was always exceptional, but alongside the furs were grisly trophies for all to see. Fresh crow scalps, their jewelry, and their weapons. A palpable chill would descend on the fort at his arrival. Other trappers might quietly joke about whether he salted the livers for the journey, but none were ever foolish enough to say it in his hearing. His friend Delguay, a man hardened by the frontier, was physically sickened when he recounted seeing Johnston pluck out and devour a man's liver. It was an image that defied all civilized understanding. The Crow Nation made one great dramatic effort to end his terror, sending 20 of their most decorated warriors to hunt him. Johnston met them on their own terms, and, one by one, killed every last one. The unspoken question lingered in the air at every outpost. Was this endless, gruesome harvest a fitting price for one family? For Johnston, the accounting was far from over. A story as potent as liver-eating Johnson's could not be contained by the mountains. It bled out across the West. A narrative virus passed from campfire to campfire. The gold-seeking 49ers heard the tales in the high passes and carried them to the California coast, each retelling amplifying the darkness of the legend. Johnson ceased to be a man of flesh and blood and became a myth, a figure of what some called divine madness. He was the human embodiment of the frontier's cruelest aspects, a man who had looked into the abyss and decided to set up camp. His story was the perfect nightmare for a landscape that was already soaked in it. He became the official boogeyman of the frontier. In the lonely, vulnerable forts, mothers used his name to terrify their children into behaving. "I'll get liver-eating Johnson after you with his knife" was a threat that carried real weight. His rare visits to civilization were public events. When he rode into Fort Laramie, doors were bolted, shutters were drawn, and people peered through the cracks at the terrible recluse. They claimed you could feel a chill of death as he passed. This silent, red-bearded giant. He was an outcast, a figure of fear and revulsion. And yet, beneath it all, he was afforded a universal, grudging respect. In a world of chaos, his unswerving and absolute purpose gave him a bizarre kind of gravitas. He was, perhaps, the loneliest figure the West ever produced. This shield of terror, however, was also a powerful advantage. In the violent marketplace of the fur trade, being the most feared man in the territory was a fantastic survival strategy. His very name protected his traps from theft and his camps from attack. No tribe wanted a war with a man who fought on such personal, horrifying terms. This reputation even allowed him to play politics, nudging tribes against each other for his own benefit. The strangest paradox was his professionalism. For all the gruesome stories, the beaver pelts he brought to trade were always of the highest quality, perfectly prepared. Traders, whatever their moral stance on cannibalism, were always eager for his business. The monster, it seemed, was also an impeccable craftsman. The ultimate proof of his long, bloody campaign was the final reaction of the Crow themselves. After the annihilation of their elite war party, they understood they were not fighting a conventional enemy. This was not a war for land or glory, it was a personal plague. For 2 decades they had lived under the shadow of his vendetta. His war had been so persistent, so devastating, and his legend so absolute, that the Crow Nation came to a shocking conclusion. The Dopiek Absaroka could not be defeated. And so, in one of the great ironies of American history, they sent emissaries to make peace. The man who had sworn to wipe them from the earth was about to be offered brotherhood. The most difficult part of the liver-eating Johnson story isn't the killing, it's the ending. How does a man who spent 20 years waging a personal war of extermination against a single people suddenly stop? How does the Dopiek Absaroka, the Crow killer, become a blood brother to the Crow? The answer is as tangled and contradictory as the man himself. To understand it, you have to look past the legend and see the man who operated by a strange, unwritten, and deeply personal code. Johnson was far more complex than the monster of campfire stories. He was not simply inhuman or insane. In many ways, he was not even simply cruel. Outwardly, Johnson was the archetype of the hardened mountain man, terse, gruff, deeply suspicious, and sparing with his words. He moved through the world as a silent observer. But his silence was not an absence of thought. He would speak when he felt it was necessary, either to correct a falsehood and set the record straight, or to point out a danger his companions had missed. It was the pragmatism of a man who knew that the wrong information could get you killed. While his actions painted him as a genocidal maniac, his personal philosophy was surprisingly nuanced. He held a very real respect for the fighting prowess of warriors from many tribes, even as he was actively hunting one of them into oblivion. He himself insisted that his killing of Indians was never indiscriminate, and that he often operated by trusting in his enemy's own sense of honor. This personal code is what makes him so difficult to categorize. He was famously proud of the fact that he never had to kill a white man, not even a Frenchman, a statement dripping with the dark humor and strange prejudices of the era. He only killed those who declared themselves his enemy, and he never, ever refused a challenge. This wasn't the behavior of a rabid dog. It was the behavior of a man with a rigid, if violent, sense of order. Perhaps the most telling glimpse into his soul is his friendship with a woman known as Crazy Woman. She was another soul forged by tragedy, a settler who had single-handedly killed 4 Blackfoot warriors to avenge her own murdered family. Johnson didn't see a madwoman. He saw a kindred spirit. He helped her bury the men she'd killed, built her a cabin to survive in, and for years, secretly left food and supplies for her. The West's most notorious killer of Indians was also the silent guardian of a white woman who had done the very same thing. This brings us back to the Crow. At some point in his long war, something shifted. After years of being hunted by their greatest warriors, after seeing their gallantry and their refusal to break, Johnston's hatred seemingly gave way to a grudging admiration. The relentless hunter who ate the livers of his enemies decided the war was over. He made peace with the Crow and became their brother. It was the final, unbelievable entry in his bloody ledger. He was not a man who sought out trouble, but he never flinched from it when it arrived. For him, living by the gun and the knife was a fact of life, and killing those who threatened his home or his work was, in his own mind, just routine. Was he a savage monster, or was he simply a man who perfectly mirrored the brutal reality of the frontier? The truth is, he wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was a product, and history has never been quite sure what to make of him. In the end, John Johnson's bloody vengeance led him not to a lonely grave, but to brotherhood with his sworn enemies. The Crow took his family, so he took hundreds of their livers, and then, somehow, he took their respect. It's a reminder that the West wasn't built on simple heroes or villains, just on brutal necessities and incomprehensible codes of honor. The past is a savage country. We've got the map. Subscribe for the next expedition.